series. First of all, thanks everybody for coming, and also thanks to the Kaylee Club for letting us use this building for these very important events. If we didn't have the Kaylee Club, we probably wouldn't be able to do these cultural events that we do every month. And I'm just going to go very quickly. We have a couple of announcements. The next meeting of the 1916 committee, of which you are all invited, will be on Thursday, April 11th at Patrick's Pub. It's at 7 o'clock. And very often it's at these meetings where an idea for a lecture comes up and somebody has an idea and we talk about it, and then eventually somebody raises their hand and says, I'll organize it. So the more people we have at the meetings, the better off we'll be. We'll get more and better and good, interesting ideas. After the meeting, there's generally a session in the pub with some nice Irish music, so it turns into to be a good night. Our May lecture is going to be on Friday, May 3rd, and it's back here at the Kaylee Club. And we're lucky enough, we have Dr. Tim Hoyt of the Newport Naval College will be with us again. He's given a couple of very interesting talks for us in the past, and this one I think is going to be very good. The title of the lecture is The Irish Revolution and the American Diaspora, 1900 to 1924. So there'll be more information going out from the committee about the specifics and more information on that, but pencil it in, Friday, May 3rd. Another event coming in May is our annual Irish Hunger Striker commemoration. We don't have a date firm on that yet, but as a lot of you know, every year we do a short commemoration just to keep the memory of those 10 men who gave their lives on hunger strike in 1981. Last year was our big event when we unveiled the monument, and if you look at that, like it's magic. And we had this beautiful quilt with the photographs of the 10 men. After the lecture tonight, there's going to be music downstairs. Sean Connell will be playing, so stop in, get something to eat, a drink, listen to the music. You may have noticed before we started, we have a raffle with some nice prizes in the back. The tickets are 6 for $5, and there's good prizes. And just so you'll know, the money that we take in from the raffle goes to pay for the musician we have the night we have a lecture here. And just, if anyone's interested in a trip to Ireland, it's called Ireland Coast to Coast with airfare from Boston, and it's in October. And Valerie is here, and she's got some flyers and everything, and if you're interested, she'll be in the back of the room after the lecture, and you can get more information on that. As you can tell, there's a lot going on at the Kaylee Club, and one thing that really isn't Irish related, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, is that on April 20th, Saturday night, April 20th, we're going to have a very special event here, and it's called Remembering the 2004 Boston Red Sox World Champions. Okay, so there's going to be videos, there's going to be stories. The Yankees will play a very big role in it, don't you worry. We're going to have lots of memories, Fenway Franks. We're going to have sausage and peppers. There's no cover charge, but we're going to be collecting donations for the Jimmy Fund. The pub and the kitchen open at 4:20, and the video is going to start at 6:30. So I have some flyers if anybody's interested in that later. And okay, now finally, 1916 committee members Pat Brady and Jim McGetrick are going to talk about our lecture tonight, which is Immigration Then and Now.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. Sorry for the delay. I wish the next time we have one of these that somebody would bring their 15-year-old nephew or niece in. Okay, before I start, two things. First of all, in the discussion tonight, you'll hear the word famine and you'll hear the word hunger. And what we're doing, both of those terms tonight will mean the same thing. They refer to the period between 1845 till 49, when Ireland was devastated by the famine and hunger. And also, this is very important, there's a question and answer afterward. I appreciate if you have any questions to stand up and ask them, because I'm deaf. And Jimmy or somebody else will receive them and repeat them, and then we can answer them. Otherwise, I'll just be saying, that's a good question. Okay, let me start. It breaks my heart that we don't have this PowerPoint, but life goes on. Riots broke out last November between police and anti-immigrant protesters, resulting in a double-decker bus being burned to the ground and windows being smashed at a Holiday Inn and at a McDonald's. A Foot Locker store was looted, a police car was burnt out, and 400 officers were deployed to restore order in Dublin. In Dublin? How can that be? Well, in the year leading up to the riot, over 100,000 Ukrainians sought refuge in Ireland, joining the other non-Irish residents who make up over 12% of today's population there. But although immigration is on Ireland's front burner and they will play a significant role in the country's 2025 national elections, the Ukrainians had other things on their mind. Many of them would be dead if they hadn't fled their country's war with Russia. Tonight, Jim and I will show how, throughout history, people have decided to leave their home country when they realized that staying there would be too dangerous. Whatever it was they were escaping from, whether it was violence, war, hunger, extreme poverty, nowadays, fire and flooding, remaining home was impossible. And will attempt to portray abandoning one's home for parts unknown through the eyes of the victims. The terms refugee, asylum seeker, and migrant are often used interchangeably with governments and even support groups speak about people who are on the run. So tonight, we'll use these definitions from our State Department. Officially, refugees are those who have fled their own country to escape persecution. They cannot return there safely and require permanent resettlement to a third country because they are unable to remain where they currently reside. Think Ukraine to Ireland for a limited stay and seeking to move across the ocean to America to live. If the United States has determined that their group is particularly vulnerable, it will provide a pathway for resettlement here. Also, signees of the 1951 Geneva Convention protocols are legally obligated to protect these folks. Asylum seekers, on the other hand, have left their home country for the same reasons, have entered another country seeking protection, but haven't been legally recognized as a refugee and are awaiting a decision on their claim. Now, migrants. Migrants are persons who leave a country of origin for whatever reasons and go someplace else. And tonight we're not interested in those migrating from home because they think it would be cool to live someplace else. And we won't be discussing factors which influence those who migrate to find a better job in a different country. Nor will we be talking about chain migrations where natives of a particular place follow earlier migrants, often using funds sent home to them for that purpose. Tonight, our presentation will concentrate on those migrants who have found themselves metaphorically looking down the barrel of a gun. They've been driven from home and are dealing with basic survival. We'll review what happened to the 3,006 tenants who faced starvation after their mass eviction in Strokestown, Ireland in 1848, and we'll see what they share with victims of Guatemala's scorched earth counterinsurgency operation in the middle of the 1980s that targeted Mayan natives and destroyed over 600 indigenous villages. A question that we'd like you to consider is this. If you're standing on the banks of the Rio Grande River in Mexico today, and you're looking out over at America as your last chance, is there any difference, is that any different from someone standing on a dock in Dublin or Drogheda during the Great Hunger and looking for one last chance across the Irish Sea at Liverpool. Jim and I hope that you enjoy our talk tonight.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Just to give you a heads up, we're going to go back and forth on 3 different sections of this presentation, trying to parallel the content. So this is part 1, Central America, a brief history of the region and people. Again, it's too bad we don't have the PowerPoint working because I did get a map that you can see where it is, but anyway. First, the definition. Central America is defined as an isthmus connecting 2 huge continents, North and South America, and a canal that now connects the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. But Central America is still poorly understood, and its unusual history is fairly unknown. 7 modern nations make up Central America: Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, and Belize, although the last 2 are not considered principal members of the region. These 5 countries, principal countries, now supply a sizable number of migrants to the United States, both documented and undocumented. Tonight we're going to look at some of the reasons for this migration. A bit of history. The first Americans, or humans, arrived on the Isthmus of Central America in 10,000 BC by way of a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. These people were most likely Mongolians and arrived on foot or in coast-hugging small boats that went down the coastline. But 10,000 BC is generally accepted as the first human settlement in Central America. So that's quite a bit of history there, and that's why I said it's a brief history that we're going to go over tonight. Of course, Columbus arrived about 500 years ago and called these people Indians, thinking that he was in the East Indies. And that incorrect label certainly stuck to this day. The people, the indigenous people that Columbus stumbled upon, were actually part of highly developed civilizations consisting of such groups as the Aztecs, Pueblos, Tanos, and Mayans. The Mayans are going to be a central part of this presentation tonight, and one reason is that they resisted conquest much better than the other indigenous people, and they established a thriving civilization whose culture endures to this day, despite the Spanish conquest which followed Columbus's arrival. What is referred to the Spanish conquest in the years 1492 to 1541 changed everything in Central America. In a nutshell, the Spanish conquistadors destroyed the Aztec and Inca empires in short order. Subduing the Mayan people was much more difficult and took much longer. Their conquest was aided in the end by smallpox. And by 1521, more than a third of the Mayan population in Guatemala was dead as a result of that disease. The Quiche Mayans fought a brave but losing battle, and Central America was soon subdued for God and crown, which is who came across the ocean in search of riches and conversion. The subjugation was, of course, accompanied by the usual European brutality. But unlike the Spanish experience in Mexico, the Mayans refused to accept foreign rule and were in frequent rebellion against the Spanish. They were brutally suppressed long into the 20th century. In an unfortunate irony of history, North America was largely taken over by the British, who early on introduced capitalism and brought the Industrial Revolution to their conquered lands. There are many spill-offs from that fact. But at the same time, Spain was still pretty much a feudal country, and that was how they ruled. The indigenous people were seen as no more than serfs to do the bidding of their masters, and that vision has remained. The Spanish did not bring any ideas of equality or liberty to the natives. In the ensuing decades, power remained in the hands of military dictators throughout Central America. By the late 1800s, capitalism had been fully introduced in the form of coffee and banana plantations throughout the regions. But this capital investment was mostly by Germans, British, and increasingly United States or North American moneyed interests, and was remarkably exploitative and set the stage for social upheaval and brutal repression orchestrated more and more by US American corporations and their government. There are a multitude of reasons why society in Central America today is so dysfunctional, and that fuels the mass migration to the US border today. However, I want to look at one particular reason: bananas. It's a funny topic in some way. You automatically think of somebody slipping on a banana, going down, you think of somebody going bananas. But this fruit has dictated some of the most repressive policies in Central America, and especially in Guatemala. But it turns out that the climate in the Caribbean islands and on the isthmus are ideal for growing bananas. I learned an awful lot about bananas, but they require a lot of land and intensive unskilled labor for harvest. And these conditions were tailor-made for foreign capital exploitation. Bananas don't grow on trees. Bananas are the tallest plants in the world. Imagine that. And bananas don't have seeds. They are reproduced by planting the roots in another place. And to do this, you need constant, use of more and more land. And they figured it out. Mainly the United Fruit Company of Boston. They soon monopolized the industry, often were given large tracts of land by dictators. Here is an example from Costa Rica in 1883. This is the contract. The government concedes to the company of United Fruit 800,000 acres of uncultivated state lands along the railroad or at any other place in the national territory of the company's choice, including all natural resources within, in addition to the land necessary for the construction of the railroad and required buildings. The 2 lots of land at Limon Harbor are all given to them at no cost. So with promises to bring in foreign investment to build a railroad, United Fruit secured exclusive rights for the use of the railroad and the ports for export. Work is on the railroad, work is at the ports, and work is on the plantation. We're forced to live in company towns and shop at company stores, in effect returning their wages to United Fruit. The consequences of such a system will be looked at in the next section.
Back to Ireland. The Irish potato famine is the greatest tragedy in Ireland's turbulent and blood-stained history. And between 1845 and 1848, 1 million people, roughly an eighth of Ireland's population, died of starvation or from diseases that accompanied it, while another 2 million were forced to flee to try to find a life somewhere else. But all this wretchedness and misery can almost without exception be traced to a single source: England's redistribution of the land it had confiscated and treated as spoils of war in the 1600s. Strokestown, I had this on a map here. Strokestown in Roscommon County in the province of Connacht is an area that had been ruled by the powerful O'Connor kings for centuries until they were defeated by Oliver Cromwell's forces in the 1650s. Cromwell impounded their land and much of the rest of Ireland as well, in all seizing over 3 million acres. And then instead of paying these guys in wages, he awarded most of the northern and eastern sections of the country to the 12,000 English mercenaries and adventurers who had fought for him. Native Irish who had changed allegiances to fight for Cromwell were also included in this group. Many of the foreign veterans then sold the gifted properties and returned home to England, leaving ownership to most of Ireland in the hands of a small, wealthy cadre of absent landlords living in England. The Irish were forced marched from their lost properties to the barren western counties of Irish-speaking Connacht, the poorest of lands, where they replaced natives there in a similar fashion. The old divide and conquer rule of England. In all, over 44,000 names were on the certificates of transplantation that documented that migration. One confiscated tract in Roscommon was awarded to Nicholas Mahon, an Irishman who had converted to Protestantism and fought alongside Cromwell. He received over 5,700 acres, centering his estate in Strokestown. Additional purchases further increased his ownership to over 11,000 acres by the 1840s. Title passed from heir to heir until it was inherited by Major Dennis Mahon in 1845, allowing him to take his place as the rare native Irishman on the list of mostly absentee English Protestant landlords. That same year, 1845, also saw the substantial failure of the potato harvest, followed by its complete failure in the years that followed. Ireland's farmers, all of whom had been tenants at will since Cromwell's takeover, had no tenure rights at all and were subject to eviction at any time and completely at the whim of the landlord. The landlords placed rent collection in the hands of agents that they called middlemen, thus assuring them of a steady income while relieving them of any direct responsibility. A middleman would lease a tract of land on favorable terms from the landlord and then become a landlord himself by subletting it in smaller sections to tenants who would subdivide their plots again into family members who then became their tenants. Rents in Ireland escalated because of the intense competition for land. Some holdings were 80 to 100% higher than similar ones in England, and middlemen parceled out their plats in smaller and smaller portions to the highest bidder, as the need for the land became more and more desperate. But by the 1840s, even the middlemen were so far in arrears on their own rent that many of them were being evicted along with their tenants. Strokestown's small-scale tillage farmers formed joint tenancy cooperatives called rundales. These were housing clusters where tenants practiced a communal style of farming, and they tried to survive in an unforgiving system designed for failure. The rundale clusters contained as many as 30 dwellings, each a 1 or 2 room, thatch-roofed, stone-walled hut, offering little more than shelter from the elements. The tenants shared good, bad, and medium quality plats as they divided the property up so that they all shared its best and its worst parts equally. In the whole of the farming system, from the minute subdivisions and the high rents to the closely packed communities living at the edges of disaster, all of it was tied inexorably to Ireland's life and death reliance on a healthy potato crop. The ability to flee was never shared equally during the Great Hunger. The poorest of the poor, they were called courtiers, were landless laborers making up the most prolific class in Ireland's social network, but they were neither healthy enough nor financially secure enough to make it through the famine, and many of them died. Over 500,000 courtiers and another 1.75 million of their dependents vanished completely during the famine. In Connacht, over 25% died of starvation or its diseases. Cholera was everywhere, and historians generally agree that as many may have died of that cholera as died of hunger. And those that did escape, to look for a new life elsewhere, stood just a rung or two higher up on Ireland's dismal social ladder than the many that were left behind to die.
moving ahead a little bit in time, we are not going to talk about land reform and civil war in Central America, especially in Guatemala. As World War II came to an end, there was a global reset. Central America was also caught up in reform movements, and attempts were made to form a federation of the 5 nations, but little came of this, largely due to foreign interference. Some democratic reforms, however, made their way to Guatemala and the rest of the region. After the defeat of fascism, the world was changing, and Central America with it. In Guatemala, the first real political progress was between 1945 and 1954, with the country's first democratically elected leaders. 2 presidents during those years. First, President Juan Arevalo, who was followed by Jacobo Arbenz, and I apologize for slaughtering those names. They introduced real reforms. Laws were introduced to protect workers' rights, and large landowners were forced to rent unused land to the peasants at low cost. During this period, hospitals and schools were built. At the end of World War II, Guatemala had a 75% illiteracy rate. The social structures of Guatemala society, it's important to understand the social structures in Guatemalan society. It closely resembles a caste system that we usually associate with India, but it existed in Central America as well, and in some forms does to this day. The Spanish who conquered the territory and then remained to rule it, of course, passed on the power and wealth to their own loyalists. A hierarchy inevitably developed where economic and political power were consolidated into the hands of very few people. These people were Spanish speakers and introduced the new concept of Christianity to Central America. In order to get ahead, indigenous people realized they would have to conform to the new rules and culture. For hundreds of years now, those native people who did not assimilate into the dominant Spanish culture were viewed as subversives and treated with great discrimination. Particularly affected were the Mayans, who tended to live in higher elevations on land that was theirs for generations. There are 21 different Mayan communities in Guatemala. They make up an estimated 39% of the 6 million people in the national populations, and they speak 23 different dialects. And even today, most tribal members have little or no knowledge of Spanish or English. President Arevalo tried to extend the reforms to this population. Mayans were mostly subsistence farmers and had generations ago been forced off the most fertile land. The Agrarian Reform Act of 1952 attempted to correct some of this inequality. This was an attempt to redistribute unused land to the peasants from large estates and plantations. The landowners would be compensated for the unused land they lost. This is where United Fruit comes back into the picture with tragic consequences. Under Guatemala's US-supported dictatorships, United Fruit owned more than 32% of Guatemalan land. Much of the land they owned was not producing anything. It was controlled to eliminate competition for the banana crop. This was the land targeted for redistribution by the reformist government. Now, for years, United Fruit claimed that this land was only worth $1 million to keep their tax payment down. Now that they were supposed to be compensated for the lost land, United Fruit claimed that it was actually worth $16 million. Sounds like a president we know. To their credit, the Guatemalan government refused to agree and left the compensation at the previous taxable rate. The government then proceeded to distribute the unused land. United Fruit then ran back to Washington, D.C. and claimed to the US government that their corporate profits were being stolen by a foreign government. There's a long history of this type of thing going on. It was known as gunboat diplomacy, when a Central American country, particularly Nicaragua and Panama, didn't cooperate with the capitalist lords. The United States government would just send Navy and Marines down, and oftentimes they would never even leave the boats. They'd just be in the harbor as a threat, and they get what the corporations would get what they wanted. The State Department was all ears and wanted to make sure nothing like this happened in the Western Hemisphere. This was 1953 and 1954, and the new threat to the world order was communism. And nothing said socialism like land redistribution. Now, there's nothing anti-capitalistic about the Agrarian Reform Act. Remember, it was taking unused land, paying for it, and giving it to peasants. United Fruit and coffee plantations claimed they were being forced out of business despite record profits. And the US Central Intelligence Agency began to organize a coup against the reform leadership in Guatemala, and it would be replaced, the democratically elected government would be replaced to protect United Fruit's interests. This affected military people from the previous governments were organized by the CIA in Honduras, and they easily deposed the existing government, sent the leaders into exile, and replaced it with one much more sympathetic to US corporate profits. The result was a civil war that lasted more than 30 years. Elections were outlawed, and the military controlled the government and business community. With full US backing, the repression reached incredible levels. The repression inevitably sparked resistance. The opposition to the streets, the guerrillas to the countryside, and the government devoted itself to the elimination of what it called a communist threat. All criticism of the new military government was met with government brutality that united the middle class, the landless, and the long reclusive mayans. One particular horrible example happened in a city or town, Ravenel, on Independence Day, September 15th, 1981. The local government and military ordered all people to go to an Independence Day celebration in the town center. Villagers came down from the mountains into the town center. After a speech by the commanding officer warning the population about siding with the insurgents, police went into the crowd, arresting people on a blacklist. Those people were never seen again. After some tried to run, they were gunned down. Chaos ensued, and when it was over, that one day, at least 800 people have been killed by the military. An exact number will never be known.
Okay, back to Ireland. Even though the Irish and the British parliaments were combined to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the United Kingdom conveniently didn't consider Ireland to be a region that it had any direct responsibility for helping out. The English got away with treating it separately, accountable for solving its own problems, including a swarming, poverty-stricken population in dire need of some sort of social safety net. Its English masses had already determined that Ireland would have to address its poverty disaster alone when it had passed the Irish Poor Law Act, whose stated goal was to alleviate the sufferings of the Irish poor. But that premise is pretty hard to buy. It functioned more like a very cost-effective incentive for destitute paupers to stay in Ireland rather than to migrate over to England. The Act also taxed Ireland's farmers to pay for the relief projects it introduced, and for any food, clothing, and shelter that was provided. Outdoor relief included soup kitchens and road building and indoor relief meant admission to the workhouses. Landlords were creative in their avoidance of these new costs. One of their strategies was clearing penniless tenants from an estate by getting a judgment order against them who were owing rent instead of an eviction order. With a judgment order, tenants were thrown in prison to be cared for by the state, whereas if they were evicted, the maintenance of the workhouse would have been covered by the landlords. Also, of course, with husbands in jail on judgment orders, their wives and their kids were left to fend for themselves on the streets. The Poor Law also introduced its famous Quarter-Acre Act, which limited relief to tenants with less than a quarter acre of land. Quarter acre is about from the goal line to the 25-yard line on a football field. And on this, the people would have their house, everything they owned. In the backyard, they'd have to have a field to grow potatoes, which they would sell for income, and the other equal size for potatoes that they would use for their sustenance, so it was tiny. Starving families on anything larger could not receive any outdoor relief or be admitted to a workhouse. They were targeted because it was believed that they were the most apt to trick relief officials into providing them with help that they didn't really deserve. The English, of course, were constantly on the lookout for being victims of the devious Irish. And although Parliament claimed to model the new Irish workhouse system after the one that had set up just 2 years earlier in England, there were major differences. One was that in England, eventually work would become available. So inmates there would anticipate sooner or later leaving. But this was not the case in Ireland, where though inmates were desperate for job offers, there were none. Another aspect was that food would be given to those in England's general population who might be starving, while again in Ireland, this was not the case. With the arrival of the Great Hunger, refusing the workhouse usually meant starving to death. Ireland's 163 workhouses were present in nearly every community and were like prison. Entry was open only to the landless, and an entire family had to move in together, thus aiding landlords in clearing the property of their tenants. Family members were segregated and assigned quarters according to age and gender, with only children aged 2 or younger allowed to stay with their mothers. All had to work, all had to wear uniforms, and all had to eat their meals in silence. Even the elderly and the infirm had duties. Families separated under such draconian conditions often never saw one another again. Over 900,000 Irish, among them 120,000 children, were living in workhouses designed to accommodate just 80,000. The kids were often described as little more than skeletons covered in sores and dressed in rags. This system of indoor relief operated for 80 years, from the 1840s to the 1920s. And for most of that period, the workhouse was recognized as the most feared and hated institution ever established in Ireland. Lack of available room in this indoor system gave rise to outdoor relief in the form of soup kitchens and useless public works projects. The Soup Kitchen Act was passed in 1847, set up in May of that year. By August, it was feeding free, watery soup to 3 million people daily. At the same time, over 730,000 people in Ireland were being paid just 14 cents a day, building unnecessary roads and bridges in accordance with England's laissez-faire injunctions against undue government interference in Ireland's free market economy. Skeletal men and women broke stone for bridges where there was no water and for roads that went nowhere, benefited no one, and would never be used. But at the day's end, their work allowed participants some soup in a government-run kitchen, a meal often accompanied by a Protestant proselytizer's servant. The system was mismanaged and it didn't last long. That autumn, after just 5 months, the soup kitchens were shut down.
Okay, moving right along, we're going to talk about immigration here from Central America in the recent past. The Civil War in Guatemala ended in 1996. It is estimated that by the end of the war, 200,000 indigenous Guatemalans of Mayan descent were either killed outright or abducted and disappeared. There was no happy ending to the Civil War, quite the opposite. By the end of the Civil War, the United Fruit Company had gained control of 42% of Guatemala's land, as well as an exemption from paying taxes or import duties. It owned all of Guatemala's banana production and monopolized all its banana exports as well. And it owned the country's entire telephone and telegraph system, as well as most of the country's railroads. Now, this was orchestrated by the CIA in training camps for the militias in Central America. So the next time you hear Sean Hannity talking about the United States becoming a banana republic, this is a banana republic that I'm talking about here. United Fruit proved once again that it pays to have friends in high places, namely the US State Department and the CIA, who trained the Guatemalan militias that carried out so many atrocities. The training took place at a place called the School for the Americas in North Carolina. This intervention also gave rise to the saying, "Yankee, go home." When I was a kid, I used to think it referred to the guys in pinstripes from the Bronx. But doing this research, I learned a whole lot. But Yankee, go home has been a saying in Central and South America for a long time. After this, and another interesting thing, that the Monroe Doctrine was put into effect in 1823, and foreign countries weren't supposed to come into the Western Hemisphere after that. That's a little arrogance right there. But anyway, after the Civil War, another danger appeared on the scene: drug cartels. With the government still largely controlled by military and former military, the lucrative business of running cocaine and heroin to the United States became a new Guatemalan export industry. These armed gangs, often protected by the authorities, forcibly recruited people into the trade, and for impoverished people, the lure can be attractive. But the mayhem that this business creates, including threats and brutal retaliation against those who resist participating in it, terrifies those who want no part of it. Amnesty International estimates that over 10,000 Guatemalan peasants were killed between March and July 1982 alone, with their farmland stolen or redistributed to right-wing money interests, while a man was appointed president named Mont, M-O-N-T-T. He was only president for 18 months. But in 2013, decades after these atrocities, a group of indigenous activists pursued war crimes against Mont. Many witnesses testified against them, but as the trial proceeded, an authoritarian backlash was fostered by the new right-wing leaders, fearing that they could be the next ones on trial. And in short order, 26 people who brought the charges against Mont had been murdered. Even so, Mont was found guilty and sentenced to 80 years in prison. But he was a member of Congress and was therefore immune. He died of a heart attack in 2018 at age 91 and never served a day in prison. Along with vast income inequality in Guatemala, with no serious reforms in sight, the viciousness of the drug gangs, many Mayans see no future except escape to the US. I used to be a teacher at Mount Pleasant High School, and I saw the effects of some of this, my experience was particularly related to one kid, one student, who was an athlete, a pretty good athlete, and he had his own trouble with violent drug cartel in Honduras. And with his mother's blessing, with his mother's blessing, he walked all the way from Honduras to the United States. When he told me the story, I said, what could conditions possibly be like to have a mother tell her 15-year-old son to walk to Texas? I kind of dropped it, but I also investigated a little further. The distance from the border of Honduras to Texas is approximately 1,100 miles, and it would take 38 days if he walked 10 hours a day. I never tracked him down to find out how long it took. Of course, not everybody walks the whole way, but there are people who do. There were 2 other students at Mount Pleasant. It's not funny, really, but I talked to them, and they were from Panama. They skateboarded all the way, replacing the wheels and all that. But at this point, it is important to discuss U.S. immigration system. This boy that I was talking about, he got in because he had contacts in Providence, and he was going to go to school. But the U.S. immigration system is a mess. Many talk, radio, and TV shows highlight polls that find that many U.S. citizens today think our southern border is the most important issue in the upcoming election. And it must be admitted that the immigration system is broken beyond broke. It must be incomprehensible to a frightened, desperate migrant from another country. My research gave me a headache just trying to understand what the procedure would be for somebody coming from Central America to try to enter this country legally. Now, I'm a retired teacher, not that that is much. I'm a native-born American citizen, and I went to college too. I couldn't understand what advice to give somebody who wanted to come. And this policy is confusing by design to discourage people from coming. It's a criminal. Neither political party in this country nor the corporate interests that fund them are serious about reforming the system. Yet they throw wild accusations at each other. The real people who are losing out are the young men or women from Guatemala or wherever who have concluded that they have no recourse other than to leave home. And then they are hit with the most confusing set of rules you can imagine. The people who are seeking asylum to the United States are advised to make their way to the US border and turn themselves in to the gods. Most Guatemalans would have had a coyote guide them right from the start in Guatemala. They would have paid the equivalent of 1 to 3 years' wages for that service. After an undetermined amount of time in a detention center, once the migrant has turned himself into the Border Patrol, the average stay is usually over 50 days. The migrant would then be given a court date for an asylum hearing, often months in the future, and most importantly, a tracking device, and would be free to enter the United States. The tracking device could be an ankle bracelet or something on your phone, an app. Of course, for a few different reasons, some migrants don't follow that route. They won't turn themselves in. They cross the border and try to make their way without being registered, so to speak, undocumented, so to speak. Now, once that happens, that person has to locate people who are going to help him. This is something that exists certainly when Pat's famine people came over. I know my grandmother got here and had a piece of paper in her pocket. I think she was 15. It said Bridgeport Con. So she was supposed to go to Bridgeport, Connecticut and meet people, I guess, from Offaly, where she was from. And so the same thing is true today. People who are coming over, they're going to people that might be related to them or have communities. But either way, that's the only way they can get help. They are not legally permitted to work, nor are they eligible for welfare, food stamps, or subsidized housing. Only after their asylum petition has been pending for 150 days can they even apply for a work permit. Even then, the work permits cannot be granted for at least another 30 days, and often takes longer than that. And even for someone who truly fears for their own life in their own country, asylums can be denied for many reasons, including making a mistake on the application, which is very complicated, not explaining in enough detail why you have this fear of not returning to your home country, not having an attorney, or having an incompetent attorney who doesn't know the immigration law, or simply having a hearing officer who doesn't believe you or is having a bad day. An important development in the whole asylum system attempt was a new policy instituted by President Trump at the urging of advisor Stephen Miller. This policy was the separation of refugee children from their parents upon entering the United States. With small modifications, this policy still stands with the Biden administration. In preparing for this lecture and investigating and trying to understand this immigration policy, I have spoken with a few people who work in the field. One, a man named Kevin Andrade, who is from New Bedford, is a journalist, and he wrote a front page article in the Providence Journal in December 2019, which describes the separation of a father from his 14-year-old son at the border and their eventual reunification here in Providence years later. Very reminiscent of the workhouses Pat has described in his presentation. Today I went to Staples. I have the article that Kevin Andrade wrote, and I went to Staples. I wanted to have copies for everybody, but for whatever reason the print was too small, and I know at our age we like those big large print books. But if anyone wants me to send them the article, it's a fascinating 3-page thing in the journal about a kid. He's out of high school now, but he was going to Providence High School at the time, and his father finally made it to reunite with him. But I'll be happy to email it to you if you want that, but just see me at the end. But that's
it?
that, I think.
Okay. Meanwhile, back in Ireland. When Dennis Mahan inherited his enormous estate in 1845, many of his tenants owed him upwards of 3 years' worth of unpaid rents on acreage that had been divided and subdivided over and over for generations, while his population living on his properties had soared. When the 1847 census revealed that there were 12,000 people living on his estate, but only 745 of them were leaseholders, Mahone decided to rid himself of 2/3 of them. If he evicted them and they went into a workhouse, he would be taxed over £7 per year for their maintenance. But if he shipped them to Canada, it would only cost a one-time charge of half that amount. He proposed a scheme in which any destitute tenant who would willingly abandon his plot of land to him would be provided free passage to Quebec on a vessel that Mahan would charter to take him there. At the same time, Mahan warned all of his other tenants that he might evict them if they refused that offer. So for Mahan, it was a no-brainer, and he provided £4,000, English pounds, for the passage for more than 1,000 of his Strokestown tenants. But when one of the scows he had chartered, the Virginius, reached quarantine station in Quebec, over half of its 476 passengers were either dead already, or else they were dying. And his other 3 vessels suffered similar fates. But an unregulated free market like Ireland's in the 1840s was made for guys like Mahan. And by the time his coffin ships had cleared the horizon, the passengers destined to die on them had already been reduced to nothing more than a journal entry. He then evicted 3,006 of his tenants who had refused his offer to sail to Canada. Included in this group were 84 widows. His plans were to colonize his cleared lands with Protestants, a better class of tenant, but there was little response to ads he placed in Scottish newspapers. The government, meanwhile, in August of that same year, ended all soup kitchens and scaled back the outdoor relief, thus cutting off 20,000 people in Roscommon from the basic nutrients that were keeping them alive. So Mahan's evicted tenants were forced to join the mass starving paupers, marching in desperate panic to the nearest Irish seaport for passage out of country and out of their misery. Those leaving Strokestown made their way east to Dublin, but by then they would have gone anywhere because they knew that they would die if they didn't. The closest destinations were in Britain, so Liverpool, Glasgow, and ports in South Wales became the targets for over 1.25 million of them. Though short in distance, their trip to Liverpool was hazardous and physically demanding for passengers weakened by starvation and by malnutrition. And shippers tended to protect valuable baggage below decks while crowding humans and livestock together on the open deck above. Little improved upon their arrival in Liverpool, where authorities met sick passengers with dismay, while noting the bodies of those who failed to reach the port alive. Most Irish who ended up there during the famine were poor and unable to afford a venture anywhere further. And on this note, my family fits in. My great-grandparents on my father's side were in Longford, and they made their way down to Drohegan, and they had enough to get over to Liverpool, and that was it. He went to work in one of the mines there. They raised a family there. My grandfather left Liverpool and came over here without ever stepping foot in Ireland. And poverty wasn't the only characteristic that distinguished them from Liverpool's natives. Religion, race, dress, and accent made them identifiable targets. Paddy and his female equivalent Biddy were traditionally depicted there as being dirty, poor, stupid, lacking in both skills and social graces, having a high propensity to both alcohol and crime, and being extremely fertile. English poor laws allowed for deportation of a pauper applying for relief if he didn't have official residency in that locality. So, anyone who wasn't born there or didn't work there for a certain number of years could be shipped back to the place of his birth. But Irish that were deported back to Ireland were rarely returned to their place of birth. They were usually unceremoniously dumped onto the docks of Dublin or Drogheda, once again destitute and unwelcome. With their former Irish homes taken and being unable to find a life elsewhere, few returnees survived. This was a common occurrence. The number of removal orders from Liverpool peaked in 1847 when 15,000 paupers were deported back to Ireland. And those figures remained high before they stabilized in the mid-1850s at approximately 4,000 deportees a year. Back to Major Mahone. He was driving a carriage through his estate one evening when a man stepped out of the darkness and shot him, killing him instantly. So who pulled the trigger? Well, just prior to Mahan's meeting his maker, a Catholic priest ended a mass in front of a packed congregation by saying that Mahan was worse than Cromwell, and yet he lives. And as it turned out, this was likely a death sentence. Eventually, 4 men were arrested, tried, and convicted of murdering Major Dennis Mahan. 2 were summarily hanged, while the other 2 had their sentences of death commuted, and they were transported to Australia, where they would have to stay for life.
Okay, you'll be happy to know that this is the conclusion. And so, obviously, the beat goes on. People all over the world continue to migrate, to seek asylum, trying to escape unlivable conditions. Today, we constantly hear that the crisis at the southern border, that there is a crisis at the southern border, that these people are invading, they don't want to assimilate, they're criminals, they're polluting our blood, they're shiftless, and are taking American jobs. Of course, out of the other side of the mouth, they say, but they don't want to work, they just come here for the freebies, like welfare and public schools. Please recall that the same things were said about the Irish immigrants. We even have English words named after us, like paddy wagon. You know, some of us, I know people my age probably spent a little time in paddy wagon. I know Terry Cannon and Alex, come on. We might have been in the same paddy wagon. But, you know, one time there was, anyway, I asked the chief of police of Providence, I was talking to him about this after the St. Patrick's Day parade. He had been the Grand Marshal. I forget his name. But anyway, I said, Chief, how come they're still called paddy wagons? Why didn't they get called Tony wagons, and then Jose wagons, and then Aunt wagon? No, they just stayed paddy wagons. Of course, there was the No Irish Need Apply signs that we're all so familiar with and have heard about for generations. And that's all true. And the same things were said about other people that are here now, right? The Italians, the former slaves after the Civil War, the Jews, the Chinese, the Mexicans, you can go on, right? It is so difficult to explain why the U.S. can't come up with a plan to end the chaos of this present immigration system. It would certainly be in everyone's best interest, but unfortunately, it doesn't serve the needs of the rulers of this country. They feel more secure if we are fighting each other and always blaming newcomers for our problems. You know, as an aside, me and Pat got together quite a few times preparing for this thing. And a number of times we met up in his hood and went to the Attleboro Public Library where we could have some quiet and talk and things like that. On Tuesday we were there, and Pat shows me this newspaper. It's the Attleboro Sun Chronicle, right? And there's an article, area white supremacist incident cited. And there's a poster that was distributed in Attleboro. And it had it would have been on your PowerPoint if we had it. There's like a Minuteman with a rifle. And it says, New Englanders, you are being replaced. Organize and resist. That's the poster. This article goes on to talk about that and how the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, documents how many more cases there are like this of white supremacy and this kind of attempts at organizing. But so we're not making this up, baby. This is the real deal, you know. Now, most of us here are from Irish ancestry. And it's good that not everybody here is from Irish ancestry. Our grandparents and great-grandparents endured great hardship to get to the United States. But we have done quite well here. We have even had 2 Irish Catholic presidents. In Rhode Island, we've had several Irish governors. The thought 100 years ago that there would ever be an Irish Catholic president was impossible. Al Smith was just trashed when he tried to run. It seems that due to the success of so many Irish Americans, that we have an obligation to be a little more sympathetic to people coming here, fleeing horrendous conditions in their homelands. We owe this to the previous generations that faced discrimination and hardship on their arrival here. Let us show our appreciation to those who made the path for us by extending a hand to those who need one now. The end. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you found it educational, informative, or whatever. And if there are any questions, we'll entertain them. Okay, good. There's basketball on downstairs right now. Really, any questions? Anybody have a thing they're confused about or wasn't clear about? Or? Yes.
Why Guatemala? Why, I mean, when the two of you got together to put this thing together, how did Guatemala come up in relationship to Ireland? I found it fascinating.
Yeah.
I may never eat bananas again, but.
I recommend everybody read this book. It's a mind blower. It's called Bananas: How the United Fruit Company Shaped the World. It's really amazing. But the reason Guatemala was chosen was because of my limited knowledge of that area. I knew that the resistance to the Spanish colonization was greatest by the Mayans, and I wanted to see what happened. There is also a community in Providence of Mayans, okay? This is also another great book. I got all these books out of the library. You can get them, you know. And this is called In Search of Providence. It's a little bit of a difficult read, but it tells the story of people leaving the highlands of Guatemala, making it to Providence for factory work, and now have expanded very much so into New Bedford, where there's fish packing plants. It's horrible work, but naturally that's who was doing the work. And this guy, the guy that wrote the article for the Journal, told me that a few years ago in New Bedford, the biggest raid on undocumented people working in a place happened at a fish packing plant there. I think it was called Atlantic Fish. And since then, it's been surpassed by one in Texas at a meat packing plant. But more than 400 people were arrested, deported, and the owners of the company suffered no consequences because all they hired was temporary workers from temporary, I forget what they call them, agencies. And so, I mean, that's how the game is stacked, you know, and you can look up things on YouTube about meat packing plants and fish packing plants, and you'll see it's vastly undocumented people who are working there. It's terrible work, but anyway, that's why Guatemala was picked. Okay, yeah.
35 years ago, it happened at a jewelry company that I was working at. I was working in the office, and they announced that you were going to have to come in with your, you know, a copy or your birth certificate or something the next day. Even I had to. I mean, my people have been here for 4 or 5 generations on mom's side and 10 generations on dad's side. But anyway, the next day, some of those people didn't show up.
Right.
And we never saw them again, except I saw one of the women on television on Channel 10 or something, I don't know, it was 35 years ago. And she was talking about something that had happened, in Central Falls.
Yeah.
And she was not using the same name. It was the same woman, it was Marisol, but she wasn't the same person.
Right, and again, the Irish had the same situation.
We did.
Yes.
Guys, first of all, I want to compliment you two guys on putting this together. I think you probably both learned a lot. But I worked in Nicaragua before the Sandinista Revolution, and the same thing is going on there with the United Fruit Company and the Spanish elites, and people disappear all the time. And they're communists, but actually they're just students or whatever.
Yeah.
They just disappear. It was terrible.
Yeah, horrific. It's
Yeah.
another one of the books. This is written actually by a very famous writer for the Atlantic, Jonathan Blitzer. It's called Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here. And this again is about all of Central America, but it's an eye-opener. It's a heartbreaking thing to read, you know, how little these lives mean to people in power down there.
So, you know, in our recent history, a lot of things have come out, a lot of things that we were never taught in high school, we didn't know about. In the last 10 years, this has been what's happening. But the good that I have seen come out of it, and I can speak right to my company that I work for, is we now have an inclusion and diversity group. We just hired a man who's the head of it. And then my niece, she lives in Hebron, Connecticut, Colchester. And about 7 years ago, there was a case, you know, I don't know if it was a Nazi sign or I don't know what it was. But that community came together and has developed a group called Code. And now that they're gonna have a Juneteenth thing, which, who of us heard of Juneteenth before, you know, recent? So a lot of good has come from, you know, I mean, we saw a lot of bad come out, a lot of the hate come out, but also there was people there to fight that hate, and it's common now.
But you also at the same time see the reaction to diversity, equality, integration. Yeah. So I mean, that's like disappeared in Texas and Florida. On college campus, it's an amazing pendulum swing, but this is serious stuff we're dealing with here. All right, good stuff. Thank you very much. Very good. It's the next lecture. We dive deep into the Irish Revolution. April 20th, celebrate 20 years. They said it couldn't be done. Reverse the curse.